All right, I'll introduce Eustace Mullins.
We're on already, so just go ahead. Yes.
The greatest icon of American patriotism of the last half of the 20th century. His protege, or his mentor, Ezra Pound, being the greatest icon of American patriotism of the first half of the 20th century. Eustace Mullins is probably the most famous or infamous man in America. Not by his name, although many people understand and know that Eustace Mullins is the greatest historian that we have today. And when I say historian, I'm talking about true history, not the propaganda that our news media and our secular historians have promoted. Eustace has been out of pocket for a few years, about 6 years now that you've been out of the loop.
Since my trip to Jekyll Island.
Since your trip to Jekyll Island. Do you want to tell us about your trip to Jekyll Island?
Well, I went down to Jekyll Island to do some more research on my own, alone, and after a couple of days, I woke up down there. I was completely disoriented. I didn't know where I was. And I started driving my car home, and I was driving on the wrong side of the road.
Well, let me ask you this. You went down to Jekyll Island to do some research.
Yes.
Now, Jekyll Island's where this whole thing started,
yes.
The Federal Reserve and whatnot.
Jekyll Island Club. The whole meeting was hatched at the Jekyll Island Club.
And most people know that, but it's important to know where you were and what you were doing when all this began.
They had brass plaques in the club commemorating this event.
And another important ingredient here, a piece of the puzzle, whose room were you staying in by chance?
I had called a travel agent in Atlanta, Georgia, to get a reservation, and she said, I'm going to upgrade your reservation from a room to a suite. And so when I got down there, she'd give me J.P. Morgan's tower room. The Jekyll Island, I was in the storage room by myself.
So in the midst of your investigation, all of a sudden something happens to you.
Something happened to my nervous system. I didn't know what I was doing.
This is what everybody thinks was his alleged stroke, or the result of his alleged stroke. And you were you headed north home.
Yes. I had 700 miles to go back to my home, and I
in Stanton,
drive my
Virginia.
car. And the state police and the deputy sheriffs were stopping me every half mile and testing me for. Everybody was calling in a drunk driver coming down on the wrong side of the road.
Now they didn't stop. They stopped you and then let you go. They didn't incarcerate you or.
No, because they tested me for alcohol, and I hadn't had a drink for 30 years.
Now you were on the wrong side of the highway.
Yeah.
Coming into ongoing traffic. How many vehicles were you aware of that had to get out of the way?
Oh, they were dodging me all the way. Big trucks coming head on at me.
And 700 miles of this, and cops stopping you in each state along the way.
And they never stopped me from driving at all, because they intended to get rid of me. And I made it through. I drove all the way home.
Well, what was done, do you think, to you when you overnight in the bed to make you behave like that? Did they give you some kind of drug?
They gave me some kind of drug that absolutely affected my whole nervous system.
That's your thoughts.
Yes.
Either that or it's an incredible coincidence that it happened at Jekyll Island in J.P. Morgan's room, and you were in great health until that time.
I was in perfect health. I was been working 15 hours a day for the last 10 years. That's when I wrote all my books.
So now you have an alleged stroke, which affected the right side of your body and not the left side.
Well, the principal effect was in my speech. It knocked out my speech. I had no control over it. And I would search for a name, I couldn't think of it. Because the connecting tissues were all screwed up.
Now, all those in your thinking processes have returned. So,
Completed my memory, everything's back full force.
but your bodily, your legs and your arms and whatnot, you still have.
I can't depend on my legs. I can get up out of a chair and stand up, and I go backwards all the way.
Your equilibrium is totally
Yeah, I have no
destroyed.
control over that.
Exactly how long ago did this happen?
This was in 03,
03.
2003.
I see.
this
6 years
happened.
ago. Hmm.
So, whether deliberate or by coincidence, if it's a coincidence, it's an incredible coincidence. If it's deliberate, there's no proof.
There's no proof of anything.
But when you got back, some of your family was ready to incarcerate you into a nursing home and took your power of attorney.
My brothers, my two younger brothers, had their eye on me for a long time, and they got my power of attorney and took over all my assets, and they confiscated them. I had a $650,000 stock portfolio.
What? $650,000 what?
Stock portfolio.
Oh, okay, all right.
I had a very good stockbroker, and I invested $30,000 with him. And in a year, he built that up to $650,000. So my brothers were absolutely in slavery. As they thought of getting their hands on this money, they cashed in my life insurance policy and my stock portfolio and walked away with it.
And took your checking account
And my checking account. And
put you in a nursing home.
and put me in a series of 5 nursing homes. And each one was a complete nightmare.
Now, you were agreed to this going into these nursing homes, or were you stuck there?
I was stuck there. I had no choice whatsoever. I never consulted on one of them. But I haven't been in a nursing home since. Jesse got married with one, and we hit the road, we don't know where it is since. And they had an alarm act from me in Texas because a court hearing placed me under a guardian ad litem, and that was to be in complete charge of me.
Well, that never was confirmed, or that never was adjudicated by the court.
Oh no. But
A man had taken you from Virginia out to Texas
yes,
under the pretense of publishing more of your books,
oh yes.
and
What did it-
you were going to help him, and he was going to help you.
Well, he actually wanted all of my copyrights, and I was going to hand them over to him.
Or that was his idea that you would hand them over.
Oh yes.
You fought that idea from March, when he took you out there, until September.
And then the point of attack became, with John Thurman, became to separate me and Jesse.
Well, that was another story later on.
Yes.
But the one in Texas, you were incarcerated into a nursing home there after going to the hospital.
Oh yes.
They had you on Seroquel and other drugs. 7 different kinds of drugs they had you
Oh,
on.
they loaded me up. And this Seroquel is a very powerful, it's called a chemical lobotomy.
It's considered a chemical lobotomy, which destroys that's the controlling drug that they use in hospitals and in nursing homes to control their patients.
Wow.
And
What is the name of this chemical?
it's Seroquel.
Seroquel.
It's a pharmaceutical chemical, that a prescription drug is what it is. And the purpose of it is to make you controllable, make patients controllable. So they had him on that. While he's under the Seroquel, this person that took him to Texas, his first name is Mark. Mark didn't have him on the Seroquel, but while he's under the Seroquel, this was after 7 months of him trying to get your power of attorney over your finances and medical.
Oh, yes.
So I went up to see him, and I spent a month with him, camping out on his living room floor, and realized that he was indeed in trouble. Each time that I would leave and go back home, he would wind up, 2 different times, he wound up in the hospital the next day after I left. And then the second time, the hospital sent him over to the nursing home to and incarcerated him there for 22 days. And at the end of that time, this person that had taken him to Texas to start with saw his golden goose fly in the coop. So he was pulling all stops to keep him there. So while he was under this drug, Seroquel, which is a dumbing down drug, a controlling drug.
It's a chemical lobotomy.
It's a chemical lobotomy.
You say which cuts off the frontal lobes of your brain, which are the command
Right,
center.
the command center of your brain.
Yeah.
And that's the purpose for it. But while he was under that, Mark was able to go to the nursing home with his notary wife.
Is that what you're telling me?
And his daughter and son-in-law as witnesses, and got a power of attorney signed from him, which is illegitimate and has no bearing. He used that as the ruse to get him out of the nursing home. And he took him out, and unbeknownst to us, went to a
Well, are they wrong?
A
or do you
Mexican
want to
lawyer.
go-
Mexican lawyer.
and got it done legally with the Mexicans
Well,
notary.
let me have you talk to circulation.
Then they
department.
took those papers to court
Please.
and
Judge.
before a judge, and the judge was
Circulation line two.
along with
Circulation line 2.
the social worker in the state of Texas. And they were one day, from what we understand, they were one day from getting the guardianship ad item over him. They would have put.
So we'll add it there.
Mark has these legitimate signed power of attorney over his medical and his pharmaceutical, and was one day away from turning guardianship ad item over to the social worker of the state of Texas. Once they did that, they would incarcerate him into a Texas state nursing home out of this private nursing home. And what do you call the nursing homes?
Mental institution.
They're a mental institute. Once you're there,
You can't get out.
you can't get out. It's a
Unless
done
your
deal.
guardian,
That's a guardianship from you
Yeah.
from now on.
Well, there's a second chemical that they use in the mental institutions. That is
No one in
thorazine.
circulation department.
Thorazine.
Thorazine is a very powerful chemical which affects the
There's no
nervous
one in the
system.
circulation
Well,
department.
I don't know that you were under that.
Could you call back
I don't
in
know
about-
either.
There were 6 other drugs, and I've got a list of all the drugs, and I don't remember that being
Be sure to ask
one
for
of
the
them.
circulation department.
But I know Seroquel
Okay, thank you.
was one of the main ingredients or drugs.
Thorazine has been used for a long time in mental institutions to,
But I don't know that.
right,
I don't know that
that's what he was on.
was what he was
Right.
on.
That's standard procedure, thorazine. And I've seen on television, they do it, a wild patient, completely out of control, they give it a shot in the arm, and he falls up and goes to the floor, just like that. It's instant.
And maybe that was planned, but as far as we know, that had no
Well,
bearing
I
on
don't
you
know
or your health.
if they ever used thorazine or not. But the effect on me is just the effect of thorazine.
Well, now that was the kind of effect that had from the Jekyll Island deal.
Yes.
So who knows? Who knows what happened there? But anyway, Matt Mater, his grandnephew in Stuart Strath, Virginia, and I worked together with L.T. Patterson in Cincinnati, and I got him out of the nursing home. I was the legs and and the steer of the vehicle or the car that we left Texas with. I got him out of the nursing home. By their good graces, they let him go. The nursing home did. We left. So we were totally legal. We weren't doing anything illegal by the state of Texas or the federal government's. We weren't escaping anybody's jurisdiction that they had a legal jurisdiction over him.
You're lucky that J. Edgar Hoover wasn't around.
Yes, who claimed he was the most dangerous man in America.
Well, that Jeff Hoover, for all I know, was running the whole operation with ADL.
Except Jay, yes. But anyway, we left there, came to Virginia, got everything redone with new power of attorneys, which his nephew has, which includes his copyrights on all of his books, which were the main thing that was in jeopardy, we feel. We came out to Virginia a month ago and went through your warehouses. You want to tell that story?
Well, in the backs of these warehouses, we found all of our lost books, about 300 cases, mint condition. They were all there. That's the way the man had unloaded them. When I brought, excuse me.
Had Matt Mayer been in charge of these books?
Oh yeah, he delivered them.
Yeah.
Well, he had been in charge, but Eustace is the one that stored the books and then stored on top of the books many antique and
There were Oriental rugs and
a bunch of stuff. And the books, he had six warehouses, many storage warehouses, crammed full of stuff and the books underneath. So we came out, Matt and I went through all the warehouses. We consolidated 6 warehouses down to 2, and all we have in those 2 warehouses are his books, which include Secrets of the Federal Reserve, A Writ for Martyrs, Murder by Injection, Rape of Justice, Curse of Canaan, and the World Order.
and the biography of Taylor.
And the biography of Ezra Pound, but we only had 2 cases of that, and so we've been treating them like gold, and they're, I think you got one of those.
I actually printed that book in 59, and it sold out immediately. And a guy in L.A. plagiarized the book, and he printed 3,000 copies.
Was that Morrison?
Yeah, Bill Morrison.
Yeah.
Anger Fest.
I know him.
Is he still in jail?
I don't know if he's in jail or dead or what, but he's a well-known book pirate.
Oh, yeah.
And other pirates have taken your books. Another man from California
Oh, yes. They're all there.
printed 1,000 of The Curse of Canaan.
Oh, yes. That was a Dr. Spencer.
Who?
Dr. Fred Spencer
I think I know him.
San Francisco. He printed 1,000 of my copies of my Curse of Canaan.
It may not be a good idea to name some names
Well, it may not,
in all this.
but that is the name.
Another man plagiarized your Secrets of the Federal Reserve, and the title of it has Jekyll Island in it. Something about a monster from Jekyll Island or somewhere similar to that.
The
Creature.
creature from Jekyll Island by
Well, maybe we don't want to name that book
Yeah, I know.
or that person.
We're gonna know who it is.
that's Ed Rankin.
Yeah, Ed Rankin will be a good name.
So while we're on this, for the record, then, Mr. Mullins, you were the first to expose the Federal Reserve.
The very first.
What year was that? You wrote the book, The Secrets of the Federal Reserve. Is that
It
the
was
title?
known as the Federal Reserve Conspiracy, wasn't it? The very first title. It's the one that became Secrets of the Federal Reserve. It had several titles before that. The second title was Mullins on the Federal Reserve.
Oh, it's the same book then.
The
Oh,
same
I
book,
see.
Just
And all,
And when was that written? What year was that?
1950.
1950. 52.
52.
52.
There he is.
Why don't we state, your beginning was with Ezra Pound,
Oh, yes.
and the date that you met Ezra Pound, I forget the exact date, but it was April 1949, which was 60 years ago this year.
It's St. Elizabeth's Hospital right here in D.C.
At,
At the Looney Bin.
At the Looney Bin. And they had him locked up under what charges?
No charges whatsoever. There was
Wow.
not one shred of evidence against him. And he
well,
told-
there was a charge, but never was made an official charge
Yeah.
because they knew they couldn't.
Well, that charge was drawn up by LJS.
Is that right?
He had 9 counts indicting Pound for conspiring to aid and help and enter the United States in wartime, which had the capital penalty. So he was under sentence of death, but was never sentenced. He was never been tried. And Ezra told me, he said, eventually, the Justice Department would withdraw all these charges. And I thought that was pure fantasy on his part. But it turned out to be true. Because I took a newspaper man, friend of mine, he was the editor of the Washington Post, Rex Herbert Lampton, and he was an old newspaper family. And on a whim, I took him to meet Ezra one day at the hospital.
Well, now, it's important to know where he was at this time when you took.
He was a patient, a schizophrenic, confined at the hospital in school.
Okay.
So he was a patient at St. Elizabeth's.
And it was strictly forbidden for the patients to visit each other at the hospital.
And St. Elizabeth's is a pretty big place. How far apart were they?
They were about a mile apart. Ezra was in Chesson Ward, and
I don't think it was quite a mile.
not quite a mile because these were sweeping green lawns of an arborate home
So it was in the confines of St. Elizabeth's,
in the confines.
and
And I walked right over to Ezra and his wife, Dorothy Pound, and introduced him to them. And they absolutely embraced each other at the first meeting. They never seen it before. They do all the weddings for us. And so they began a friendship, which resulted in Rex getting this congressman friend of his to go on the floor of Congress and ask the question, why is the government holding a stand?
what did Rex recognize in that first visit?
Yeah, this has been 5 minutes.
Well, he told Ezra right away
Just a minute.
and talked to him.
Let Jim get through and then tell the story. So what was it that Rex recognized?
Rex said right away, he talked to him for a minute. He said, you don't belong in here. And Ezra said, I know that. And he said, well, I can do something about it. Because he knew everyone in Washington. His best friend was George Stimson, who had founded the National Press Club.
Why don't you state again who Rex was?
Rex was a son of an old line newspaper editor himself in Fargo, North Dakota.
And what was Rex's job at the time?
He was the editor of the Washington Post.
So the editor of the Washington Post is incarcerated in St. Elizabeth's.
Yes.
You got the two to meet,
Well, I got them
Rex
together,
and Ezra Pound.
and in 3 days, they had Ezra out of the St. Elizabeth's. They dropped all the charges, and he walked free, and they abandoned all pretense of the phony charge that he was insane, because he was the most brilliant man in the world.
We skipped a little bit. Go back to what Rex did he got this congressman from North Dakota.
Yeah, he went to him directly, and the going charge for that here in Washington is $250,000.
Next time we should do it over here.
$500,000.
You're right.
Rex went to this friend of his and got him to speak up on
I think it was Usher Burdick, right?
Usher Burdick.
Usher Burdick, North Dakota, Idaho.
No, he's from North Dakota.
Yeah, North Dakota.
He's a congressman, the only congressman from North Dakota, which is a very small state. And
A large state with a small population.
I think the entire state has no Jewish people or black people in it,
Yeah?
which meant they had a secure seat in Congress, nobody could touch him. And so
He went to Congress, and what did he tell Congress?
he got on the floor of Congress and he asked a question. Why is the government holding this man? They had not a shred of evidence against him, and they had held him 15 years without trial. And they invented the charge of insanity because they said he was incapable of participating in his own defense. That had been brought about by the Justice Department came to him and said, well, Mr. Pound, you have a capital charge against you. How are you going to defend yourself? And Ezra said, I will stand over every word I said over Radio Rome. Because he had broadcast to the whole world over Radio Rome about the Second World War. And so this put them into consternation because they didn't want Ezra repeating all the charges against Roosevelt, which he made over the air. And so they called in 8 psychiatrists who pronounced him insane, that he couldn't participate in his own defense.
Eight psychiatrists, you say?
8 psychiatrists, 8
And they all
government
say he was
psychiatrists.
nuts, huh?
And they all said he was
Well,
hopelessly
they couldn't bring
insane.
him to trial
Yeah, right.
because they knew they had no case.
Uh-huh.
They could not have a case of treason against somebody who had not committed treason.
Well, the President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was a traitor.
Well, all his life.
Well, sure he was,
He was-
but
he
by the
was-
time, see, they didn't gain Ezra Pound's capture until Franklin was dead. Franklin died in April of 45. They captured Ezra in July of 45 in Italy. When they captured him, what did they do to him?
Well, first of all, a team of communist assassins was sent out in Italy to capture Ezra and kill him, just as they killed Mussolini as their mistress in a car, shot it full of holes. And so here they're searching for Ezra, and Ezra's wandering around Italy, and had no doubt. Of course, he must have known they were going to kill him, because these people are all assassins. And they run just like the mafia, they have happy end. And so this communist team of assassins was looking for Ezra to assassinate him, and he evaded them, and he was initially captured by United States Army Patrol in Italy.
Did Ezra recognize that Franklin Roosevelt was a communist himself under the guise of democracy?
But he didn't know about Algiers. He didn't even know that Algiers had drawn up the charge against him.
Right, but he knew Franklin Roosevelt, and he knew what his agenda was.
Yes, because Franklin D. Roosevelt, as president, had 3 personal assistants, and they were Algiers and Harry Dexter White and Louis Rankin.
And those were his handlers, just like Edward Mendel House had been Woodrow Wilson, and Alexander Hamilton was George Washington, and so forth.
And all 3 of these assistants were lifelong KGB agents, and they reported directly to Stalin in Moscow. So every word that
That's right.
Roosevelt sent to these three assistants for the meeting report to Moscow. And so,
Can I get
so
the-
the
the
miracle
printer?
rates are like this.
Sure.
Oh, excuse me. Can you give me those
You in my way?
papers? We're directly behind you. Give me those papers over there.
Sure.
Turn the volume.
So that's the real story of Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Yeah.
President Roosevelt had three personal assistants who were KGB agents. He had never told to the American people to this day. They had no idea who had a president. It's really in the pay of the enemy.
Mr. Mullins, if I could ask a quick question. Why specifically did they want to assassinate Ezra Pound?
Well, because these were the worst enemy. The Communist Party of the world had no greater enemy than Ezra Pound.
Because had he written a book exposing them, or what?
No, he had attacked them on worldwide radio.
Oh, I
He
see.
had a radio program through the 30s
He attacked them daily.
and into the 40s.
From
And that is why they adopted
Oh, from Italy. Oh, I see.
And that is why they adopted Stalin's favorite technique of levying a mental patient. Out of nowhere, they gave him a charge of
That's a good way to
insanity.
put it, yeah.
Ezra Pound was an expatriate, born in Idaho, and because he was a poet, had gone to London and then Paris, and wound up in Italy, as many artists have done during that time.
Well, he was a very celebrated poet.
Yes, a very
right.
celebrated, the most
And-
celebrated poet of the 20th century.
That's right. The liberals just loved him. As far as I am concerned, being a lowbrow, I couldn't even understand his poetry.
Well, his poetry was in Chinese.
Yeah, that's right.
Not really the Chinese language, the Chinese ideograms.
Yeah,
So he didn't attract too many followers
that's right.
because they couldn't read a word.
Yeah, you had to have a college education in Confucianism.
Yes, yes.
How much more time you got in that thing?
I got plenty of time, but maybe we need to be wrapping it up? Yeah. Okay. So just to wrap it up, I guess when you came up with your book, The Secrets of the Federal Reserve, nowadays every conspiracy book mentions about how the Federal Reserve is privately owned and what have you. When you wrote the book, that was sort of like unheard of, right? You were the first one that brought that out to the forefront.
When I went to the Library of Congress, they had no book on the Federal Reserve System. See, Ezra,
Well, what prompted you to go to the Library of Congress?
when I went to the hospital to visit Ezra, the first thing he asked me was, will you go to the Library of Congress and look up the Federal Reserve System?
And you went the next day.
And I
started.
went the next day, and I went every day for the next 3 years. And so I found that the first thing I found out, there was no book on the Federal Reserve System. And I thought, well, where do I start? I had no idea.
Unbelievable.
Well, those listening to this might be interested in knowing that Eustace is a speed reader and read 25 to 30 books a day. Not small books, but
Wow.
Library of Congress books.
500 and 600 pages of books on economics. That's what I was reading at the rate of 15 minutes each.
And
Oh,
that
my
was
God.
for 3 years. Now, you got a job at the Library of Congress.
Oh, yes. The Library of Congress personally hired me after he gave the valedictorian address at the Institute of Contemporary Arts. And then I read some of my poems at the meeting, and he hired me on the spot.
And you worked there for a year?
A year.
And then what happened after a year?
At the end of the year, the Anti-Defamation League had already determined that I was the most dangerous enemy that they had. And J.P. Hoover labeled me that publicly, the most dangerous man in America. Which to the communists, I was. the most
Damn right you were.
And so they laid on to me, and they stopped attacking me ever since.
So what did they do to you at the Library of Congress?
They fired me on the spot.
The only man in America, or the only person that's ever been fired from the Library of Congress for political reasons.
Yeah, that's true.
And only one of two. Who was the other person fired?
Walt Whitman, he was a very famous poet.
Walt Whitman was
I
fired
didn't know
Wow.
that.
from the Library of Congress. Only those two men.
There's only two ever found.
Well, you're in good company.
Yeah, yes.
He wasn't fired for the same reason you were.
No, he was fired on his morals because Walt Whitman was homosexual. And what he liked was burly farm boys.
So anyway, when they fired you at the Library of Congress, what'd you do?
Well, I had no money.
And no job.
And at this time, you could only get a room on Capitol Hill for $1 a night. And where was I going to get $1 a night? So I was familiar with every nook and cranny of the Library of Congress. I had a stack permit that enabled me to go anywhere in the Library of Congress on my own initiative and free to go wherever I wanted. And one place that I found out was a distant relative of mine named Catherine Sprague Coolidge. And Coolidge was, President Coolidge was one of her uncles. And so I found she built an auditorium on the ground floor of the Library of Congress, which had an apartment in it with a cot that you could lie on and a small bathroom where you could carry it and serve certain functions.
So when they fired you from the Library of Congress, you just moved in.
I moved in because I had an enormous apartment in one of the biggest buildings in Washington, entirely to myself.
And you lived there for how long?
I lived there for years.
So you moved into the Library of Congress for a year, unbeknownst to the authorities, or
I never told one person where I was.
when they would lock up, they just locked you. You would disappear into your apartment below, and they would lock you in.
Well, they ushered everybody out, and then they locked the doors. And so I walked out with them when they ushered us out, and I walked right back in. I went to my apartment.
Well, now I just want to point out that what year was that? 1950. Okay, now here it is 2009. So 59 years after that, we have legislation in Congress
That's right.
to investigate the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, finally.
One congressman is he's undoubtedly knowledgeable about your books, Eustace. Representative Ron Paul, Republican from Texas, has introduced this legislation, and now it has well over 200, I think 240 or something, co-sponsors to investigate the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is going bananas all over this. Bernanke, the head of the Federal Reserve, is just about off his gourd because people are discovering, finally, it's taken 59 years for a significant number of Americans to realize that the Federal Reserve is a privately owned and privately operated group that controls the American money in flat contradiction to the Constitution. It's a criminal organization. Our money is issued criminally by international bankers. I defy anybody to say it's not true. Thanks to Eustace.
Well, Eustace is the one that spilled the beans, so to speak, on the whole Federal Reserve and governmental system that we now have. But something that's important to understand is that nothing, absolutely nothing happens. Wasn't it Franklin Roosevelt that said that? Nothing happens except that it's planned by them.
It's planned.
It's planned.
So what we don't understand is that even by their estimation, the Federal Reserve has come to the end of its road. That's the reason that they're planning to destroy their own system. Now, we say, why in the world would they do that? It's not that they're going to destroy the control that they have. But it's just like somebody going bankrupt. When you reorganize under a different name.
Right.
They're planning. It's their plan, which is why they have sponsored so many plagiarizations of his books. They were behind the John D. Rockefeller organization of the John Birch Society are the ones who sponsored this person that wrote the Monster of Jekyll Island, or a similar name.
Great.
It sold 2 million copies of his book, The Secrets of Federal Reserve.
He printed 2 million copies.
At $20 a copy is $40 million that they made off of his book. Well, why would they do that? Because they don't mind, the secret's out. They don't mind publicizing the fact that the secret is out. And the more things that you can get out there, the more you water down his writings or his studies, his books. Why would they sponsor his book under a different title and by a different so-called author? Because that's part of the plan.
In my first edition of the Federal Reserve System in 1952, I said this is a political conspiracy. And I thought that was too strong, and I never heard one word from the Federal Reserve System.
Nobody challenged you on that
No,
statement.
indeed. And I started going to the Federal Reserve Building headquarters myself, and I talked to the people there, and they always talked to me.
You're actually quite friendly, and they were friendly to you during all this time.
Yeah, because they wanted to meet me to see where I was coming from. And I didn't tell them that you had sent me.
Well, so what are they going to do?
They're going to
Do you agree that their aim is to internationalize American money?
Absolutely.
To put it on an international basis, to ensnare us finally into a world system.
Who was it responsible for allowing the Federal Reserve Act to be passed?
Carter Glass, the senator from Virginia, who was in the hands of Kuhn Company, the Rothschild banking organization.
But they were the handlers of somebody in this nation that they put in as president.
Woodrow Wilson was personally handled by Colonel Edward House. And who was Edward House? During the Civil War, which Abraham Lincoln had personally started by attacking the South with his armies, that cut off the cotton from the mills of England. And England was going bankrupt because they couldn't make any cloth. And so they had to get cotton to England. Well, Colonel House organized a blockade running organization out of the United States. And during the entire Civil War, Colonel House supervised the running of the blockade and furnishing Manchester mills with American cotton.
Well, we're putting a lot of pieces of the puzzle.
It's all together, it's all went on.
All those pieces go together, but we're dealing with Woodrow Wilson.
Oh, yeah.
The point that I was trying to make, Woodrow Wilson was responsible. What was his number one aim in his presidency, or at least toward the end of his presidency?
Well, he was a lifelong communist who sent his own secretary to represent the United States at the Soviet Parliament.
But he wanted to get the League of Nations. The League of Nations was Woodrow Wilson's baby.
Well, that was his first attempt at a world order on an international scale.
Which is another one of your title of another one of your books, The World Order. Not the New World Order. That's their plagiarization of. I mean, the New World Order and the World Order go way back in history.
Oh, they do. And as president of Princeton University, Woodrow Wilson was in personal charge of the sons and daughters of the American millionaires who were sponsoring the Federal Reserve Act.
But he wanted to establish the world order at the time, which was the League of Nations. Of course, the United States Senate and Congress did not want any part of that.
Absolutely not. They didn't want to give up American sovereignty.
But it was finally done,
Yes.
called by a different name, the United Nations.
Oh, that was not until after World War II.
I know it, but they finally got the League of Nations, or the world order. What's the outcome of the United Nations? The United Nations is the world order.
Of course.
So the world orders, the United Nations idea is a totally communist deal, just like Woodrow Wilson's
Of course.
League of Nations, and just like Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the one responsible, even though he was dead by the time they brought about the United Nations, he was the one responsible for getting it done.
Yes. And Franklin D. Roosevelt, whom Wilson appointed as Secretary of the Navy, was Franklin D. Roosevelt's he was entirely handled by Franklin D. Roosevelt. And Franklin D. Roosevelt was a cripple in a wheelchair. And you would expect a man of that disability to be leading a big country like the United States. But the Colonel House personally handled Bela Moskowitz, a Russian communist, to handle Woodrow Wilson's and Roosevelt's candidacy of the presidency. And she pushed it right through. She had a very able alliance of communists, Zionists, and labor leaders, which put up a united front. And they first elected Al Smith as president in 1928. And the second was Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1932, which was the beginning of the downfall of America.
Wow.
And
The later beginning of the downfall of America,
Yeah.
because all these, they had many presidents and senators and congressmen that were part of the whole mix
oh yes,
all the way through.
they were all recruited into the Communist Party through Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Woodrow Wilson really wasn't even a legitimate president.
No,
Who was the legitimate president in 1912?
Robert Taft.
Who was the incumbent?
He was the incumbent, and he was a 400-pound man. And
Very popular with the country.
during Taft's presidency, the country was unusually prosperous and unbelievably united, and the country was faced a great future under Taft. So they had to have Woodrow Wilson sign the Federal Reserve Act into law under his signature.
Because Howard Taft was not going to do that.
No, and other financiers had declined to participate.
He had betrayed his handlers. Teddy Roosevelt was the first Judas goat, if you will, of the 20th century, and they got him in there. They told William McKinley, who had betrayed them, that if you don't take Teddy Roosevelt as your running mate, you're not going to be elected. So he gave up the vice president that he had in 1896 as his running mate, and took Teddy Roosevelt as his 1900
I see.
vice presidential candidate. When he did that, he signed his death warrant, because they were planning to assassinate him as soon as they made their vows, or he made his vows as president again.
Oh, so Roosevelt picked up as vice president. He wasn't elected in the
Right.
first
This
term.
was he was an appointee.
Right,
He was
right,
he was an
right.
appointee president by the banks of England
Right. And didn't they assassinated Garfield right after he
then they-
exposed?
they-
He said some famous
they
comment where he
assassinated-
exposed
right.
the money
As soon as he
powers.
made his vow to the Constitution,
Inauguration.
his inauguration. As soon as he had his inauguration, that made Teddy Roosevelt legitimately in line. And as soon as, right after that, within
Wow.
a couple of months, wasn't it?
In a couple of months.
I've got a paper on the assassination of McKinley and exactly when it went. It was a couple of months after the inauguration. It was a planned thing all the way along the line to get Teddy Roosevelt, because Teddy Roosevelt was to bring about the 1907 bank
Crisis.
crisis.
So all this all
these
this
are-
posturing by Teddy
Right.
Roosevelt
Every
going
one of
against
these
the
things,
monopolies and the
you
trust
bet.
buster, that was all
bet.
a fraud.
That was all a front and a fraud, and to make it look like Teddy Roosevelt was really us when he was a Judas goat.
Wow.
And he was setting everything up for, they couldn't do things immediately. They couldn't bring all these things about immediately. It's a long, drawn-out process over many administrations and generations.
It's a conspiracy. You have to put your agents in, you bring them in, and put them in positions of power. And the first thing Teddy Roosevelt did at the White House was to move into the White House George Perkins. And George Perkins was J.P. Morgan's personal assistant. So in other words, the White House had now become an agency of J.P. Morgan.
So this was all orchestrated from the beginning,
Wow.
right down through the line. And this is history that nobody knows or understands,
And I
except,
tell you history for the first time.
and all this history came from the Library of Congress.
Absolutely.
Wow.
It's all written down, it's all documented. Nobody can argue against it because this is documented history, not the propaganda that we hear
Of course.
from the History Channel or from the
From the
news.
court historians.
Right, or even from our educational.
And I knew when I wrote the Federal Reserve conspiracy that this scam was so apparent to everybody that it couldn't last more than 25 years. And so Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act in 1913.
Teddy Roosevelt was behind getting Howard Taft elected
Yes.
because he thought he was in his pocket and would go according to the handlers. There's always handlers of the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England, the first Bank of the United States, the second Bank of the United States, the third Bank of the United States called the Federal Reserve. They named it that because they couldn't name it the third Bank of the United States.
Yes.
Right. Right.
The coiner of the name of the Federal Reserve System was Paul Warburg,
Right.
the chief assistant to the Rothschild bankers.
Of
All
course.
done down in Jekyll Island, the famous Jekyll Island trip.
And they
Right.
named it the Federal Reserve System because they wanted the American people to believe it was federal and it was a legitimate government operation.
And that it had reserves.
Right. So Howard Taft, a true patriot president, went against his handlers, and so they call Teddy Roosevelt, who is on in Africa, on safari in Africa for 3 years, and they called him and said, "You got to get back over here. Things aren't going like you. We need you back in charge."
And
So he comes back
he ran as an
and
independent,
ran under the Bull Moose.
the Bull Moose, and
as an
got Wilson
independent to
elected on the
split the
count.
ticket.
Right. Right.
It didn't work because Howard Taft still won.
He was so popular, they couldn't elect Woodrow Wilson, whom everybody hated. Woodrow Wilson
With the
as a
sideline,
dour,
the human organs are a small
vegetarian.
part of a larger
no
conspiracy
personal
to traffic
feeling
in human
at
body
that.
parts.
He was not a speaker.
Nobody liked Woodrow Wilson. He was a nobody.
Of a larger
He
operation.
was so
This larger
disliked
operation
that when
is to
he
deal with
signed the
body
Federal
parts.
Reserve Act into law in 1913,
What do they, the human body
had no
parts
chance of
besides
getting it
body
through
parts?
Congress.
And
And
yet
so they had
they're
to
saying
go
the
to
overall
Virginia
conspiracy is body
and
parts.
pick out Senator Carter Glass to shepherd the bill through Congress, so there was no federalism.
But let's look back at Woodrow Wilson. He wasn't despised and hated by everybody because somebody wanted him there.
Oh, he was loved by the directors of the National City Bank,
There you go.
which happened to
second.
be the Rothschild Bank in New York.
Well, gentlemen, it's been a great interview. We could go on and on
I
for a
know.
long time. Thank you very much. And
Well, I wanted to tell you
yes,
that you have to realize that Woodrow Wilson was legally defeated for the President of the United States in 1912.
oh wow,
But they came to him and offered him a different position. If he wouldn't fight the lost election on his part, they offered him
Listen, I'm sitting here.
The Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court.
which he had for the next 8 years, and that satisfied him. So Woodrow Wilson was totally a total
illegitimate.
illegal
Wow,
president
They were never elected.
and never elected.
wow, wow.
And many other things like that in history that we're just not aware of.
And Taft was legally elected president in 1910. But if he was elected, but the fact is they needed Wilson's signature on the Federal Reserve Act to make it legal.
Okay.
And without Wilson had nobody.
George.
Well, Mr. Mullins, thank you very much. I'm going to have to cut it short because everybody's going crazy over here. Maybe we'll continue it a bit later or another time, but it's really been a pleasure talking to you, and you're just a wealth of information. I mean, I don't know what to say.
And, if you know this information, you're wealthier than everyone.